Welcome to Engaging Ideas, where we bring information and ideas from the Academy to the community to help think about real-world issues. Our topic today looks at the political battle over gun rights and gun regulation in America. Joining me is Dr. Trent Steidley, Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Denver. Professor Steidley's research seeks to understand how social movements, politics, and criminal justice systems interact to affect policy and criminal justice in the United States, particularly with regard to firearms. He's the author of 4 refereed articles for professional journals and several book chapters. Professor Steidley has presented at numerous professional conferences throughout the United States. Professor Trent Steidley, welcome to Engaging Ideas. The American Rifle Association and the gun rights movement are powerful political forces. We know that. Who and what is actually the driving force here? Is it the industry or the NRA or something else?
Right. I think when we think about gun rights in the United States, it's important to think about, first of all, what does public opinion on the topic look like? And so I've brought some information today to kind of show. And the first thing I would show is that when we look at how public opinion has changed over time, starting back in the 1990s, most Americans were in favor of passing stronger gun control laws. The way the Pew Center actually asked this question is, do you think it's more important to control gun ownership or to protect the right to own guns? And the way public opinion on that question has changed over time has been to favor gun control back in the 90s, but then as we get closer to the present day, that opinion has declined and support for gun ownership has increased. And then when we get to about 2008 to 2012, it gets to really be neck and neck, and it's about 50-50 in terms of where public opinion falls on gun rights and gun control. So in terms of thinking about who is driving the NRA or what is driving the gun rights movement, there's a large segment of the United States that really supports gun rights. And so I try to discourage people from thinking that the NRA is just a small minority. They represent a good chunk of the United States in advancing gun rights.
Well, so if it's a grassroots type of movement, where the NRA is actually reflecting a movement rather than creating it, what factors seem to be motivating people in the gun rights movement? For example, do people defend gun ownership by individuals because of fear of crime or a desire to keep weapons for hunting? Or what's the motivation here?
The primary motivation for a lot of people to join organizations like the NRA or support gun rights is because it really resonates with their own political ideologies.
I see.
Research by ethnographers like Jennifer Carlson, Angela Stroud, interviewing people who who are interested in concealed carrying firearms, say that they don't just conceal carry guns because they're afraid of crime. That's certainly a big factor, but also because owning a gun and carrying a gun is a way for them to practice political beliefs like self-reliance, being able to protect their family, being able to be good citizens in the community by being good guys. And then when we look at how support for the NRA has also, when we look at how the NRA kind of frames their messaging, it's not so much about trying to get people to say that they're afraid of crime or get people to say that owning a gun is the only way to protect yourself against crime. There's much more about, lived experiences. You own a gun because that was part of what your family did, hunting and target shooting. And practicing those family values or things that you grew up doing are part of people's identities. And so the big component of this is being driven by lived experiences and people's own beliefs.
Well, that's a very different perspective than one usually hears in the press. And you've noted, I think, in your work that gun rights has had a substantial impact on the firearms market, that this whole question of gun rights. And talk a little bit about that. What's happened there?
Sure. In my own research, I've really been curious about how has the gun rights movement and support for gun rights impacted not just policy, but also the prevalence and the distribution of firearms in society. And one of the things I've looked at is looking at gun sales information. And the federal government doesn't keep track of who buys a gun, how many guns are sold. But one thing that social scientists can use is what's called the National Instant Background Check System, or NICS for shorthand. And if you buy a gun in the U.S., you go to what's called a federal firearms licensee, sometimes called an FFL. These FFLs, if you go there to buy a new gun, will run a background check on you, which is part of the NICS system. In doing that, the federal government doesn't keep track of who was in that background check, but they do keep track of if a check was run at all. And when we can use that information as to say, as a proxy, you know, people aren't probably just going to get background checks for the fun of it.
Right.
They're interested in purchasing a firearm. And so we can use that as a proxy of people buying guns. I use that information to try to figure out how has gun sales changed over time. And when, and another slide that I could show you guys is that the way gun sales have changed is to favor handguns over long guns in recent years. For the longest time, the firearms market was one that favored long guns. Those were kind of the bread and butter for a lot of firearms makers. Starting in about 2008, that changed, and now most of the gun sales that are conducted in the U.S. are now for handguns.
Well, for heaven's sakes.
And so that's changed what the market looks like. And in my research, I argue that the reason this has changed a lot is because our state-level laws have changed to favor broadening gun rights at the state level. And so back in 1999, there were about 29 states that allowed people to get what were called shall issue concealed carry licenses, which lowered the bar on who could get a concealed carry license. In 2016, that number is about 39 states. And so we've seen over the past 20 years that this expansion of allowing people to have greater handgun rights to conceal carry and to get a license to conceal carry in more places has perhaps made a new demand for handguns, which has created this shift in the market to move away from long guns into favoring handguns.
That's very interesting. You know, if one listens to the news, there seems to be a lot of support for gun control legislation. Yet politically, even after horrific shootings in schools, the Las Vegas situation, which was terrible, and elsewhere, somehow nothing seems to happen.
Right.
So what's going on here?
So I think there's kind of two things going on. First, I'll talk about the gun control side, and then I'll talk about the gun rights side on this. Gun control as a movement in the U.S. has historically kind of come in fits and starts. The first modern gun control laws that we would kind of think of started back in 1968 with the Gun Control Act. And those were passed as kind of a response to a lot of political tensions that were happening in time, specifically political assassinations like Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy. Those were kind of political flashpoints that sparked this first passage of new gun control laws. And that's how we got things like FFLs and modern licensing for gun dealers. After that, there's kind of been a lull in gun control, and then it wasn't until about the 1990s when a new wave of gun control laws kind of came through. And that was kind of predicated on rising crime rates and fears about drug crime and gang violence. And now, today, the discussion about gun control is really focused on mass shootings and school shootings. So for gun control, the political mobilization for passing new gun control laws has never been consistent. It's kind of been reliant on what has been in the media or what has been driving the discussion about political action on guns. And at the same time, gun control has had the struggle with trying to figure out, do you advocate policies that are politically viable, or do you advocate policies that are going to be effective in trying to reduce gun violence? And by that I mean we could think about using mass shootings as an example. There's about 33,000 to 36,000 gun fatalities in the U.S. on average in an average year. Consistently over the past 10 to 15 years, that breakdown of gun fatalities has been about 2/3 suicides and 1/3 homicides, with accidents and unknown causes kind of making up about 1 to 2%. Now, when we talk about solutions for the gun control movement, the most popular answer, if I could just throw a, probably what might be the most popular example out on the table, is that to pass a new assault weapons ban. because a lot of these mass shootings that we see in current media coverage are focused around things like easy access to things like the AR-15. Passing a federal assault weapons ban that would focus on the AR-15 would not necessarily have a big impact on that 2/3 of suicides and that 1/3 of homicides, because most homicides are committed with a handgun. But there's not a lot of political capital to be spent on things like a handgun ban. Polling on a handgun ban shows that most Americans aren't supportive of it. But most Americans are supportive of an assault weapons ban. So if you're leading the gun control movement, not that there's one organization that represents all of them, but if you were to kind of focus on a policy solution there, there's not, do you focus on the policy that's more likely to get passed, an assault weapons ban, or the policy that might do the most good in terms of reducing fatalities, which might be something like a handgun ban, but not very politically viable?
So in a way, those supporting gun control legislation are really, this is perhaps too strong, but sort of the captive of events.
Right.
They quite understandably take that path. Let me probe that just a little bit further. It seems like there are a number of ways in which gun rights and gun control advocates could find common ground, could compromise. Things like magazine size, built-in safety mechanisms, background checks for gun show, handgun or other purchases. So without getting into too much technical detail, why haven't we seen compromises? It would seem like that would certainly be possible, but it hasn't happened. What's going on?
Right. For compromise to happen, I think on any political issue, you have to have two sides that are able to offer their opposition something in exchange for something that they want.
Okay.
For gun control and for gun rights, it's hard to imagine what gun control advocates could offer gun rights advocates that gun rights advocates haven't been able to secure on their own already.
Give me an example, if you would.
The best example I could give of this is perhaps the Supreme Court ruling in the District of Columbia versus Heller ruling. So in 2008, the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment is to be interpreted as the individual right to own a gun, rather than something that could be something like a restriction on states' abilities to restrict gun ownership. So with the DC v. Heller ruling, the NRA and the gun rights movement won a big political victory for themselves. For the longest time, the NRA had been advocating the idea that the Second Amendment was to be interpreted as an individual right. But that was something that was actually kind of open to interpretation. The courts had never ruled on it. With DC v. Heller, they got that victory. Before that moment, it would have been unlikely but plausible to imagine some kind of legislation coming down the pipe that would say, we recognize that the Second Amendment is the individual right to own a gun, but at the same time we recognize that giving a concession to the gun control side, that we will have regulations on what types of guns could be owned or bartered or available to the public. So you would have both sides recognizing something the other wanted. Gun control would give the gun rights their Second Amendment interpretation. Gun rights would give gun control advocates some kind of restrictions on guns that could be bought or sold. After DC v. Heller, there's no incentive for the NRA or any group to compromise on that. And they've won that victory by being very obstinate in the face of political opposition. Every time a challenge comes up, the NRA has learned that by digging in their heels, and the gun rights movement as a whole has learned by digging in their heels and holding out against political forces that might oppose them, they tend to win the day. And gun control advocates have kind of learned that they have to capitalize on when the iron is hot, whenever media attention and public attention is focused on the issue. And so the NRA has learned that if they can weather these tension points, they can tend to win in the long run. There's very little incentive for them to really see what the compromise could be.
Your research is not only interesting, but it certainly relates to real world issues. And I recognize that no one has a crystal ball, but it's an interesting question about where this might be going. Are we destined for this type of political standoff that we've been seeing, or in your view, might something change?
It's hard to imagine any major shift happening at this moment. Right now, with the midterm elections coming up, there's a lot of focus on the students in Florida, the Parkland survivors, advocating to try to get new politicians elected who support gun control, and that this is going to be the moment they get it done. But it's not unheard of. Previous movements have tried to do this. There was the Million Mom March back in 2000, and historically the track record isn't good for gun control on these issues. Not to say that it couldn't change this time, but that things, if we were to kind of look at the odds of it, it's not in their favor. But on the other hand, the NRA and the gun rights movement faces a long-term problem in terms of demographics. The United States is becoming more diverse, more progressive on a lot of issues, and support for gun control amongst younger groups is lower than it is amongst older populations.
Well, that's interesting.
So for gun rights advocates, they do kind of have to focus on trying to change public opinion in younger demographics, or over time they may lose support. So they face this long-term challenge. In the moment, things are very much in the favor of gun rights advocates. They have allies in all branches of government right now. They have the proven capacity to help elections. Thinking back to the year 2000, the NRA gets a lot of credit for swinging Tennessee away from Al Gore and towards Bush. And if Al Gore had won Tennessee, we would be living in a different timeline.
Right.
So the NRA has the ability to at least say, we can be contenders in every election. Gun control has not been able to do that to this moment. But over the long term, the NRA and the gun rights movement does have to recognize that their messaging and their current framing of issues may not be sustainable over the long term.
That's so interesting. Well, Dr. Trent Steide, thank you so much for sharing your insights into the issue of gun control and gun violence. It's certainly an important topic today. I hope you'll join us in the future as we bring more engaging ideas from the Academy to the community. I'm Jim Grismer. Thank you for watching.